Hey there and welcome to the channel. You're watching The Light in My Library. So today is episode 1 of our ReRead read-along for the Mistborn Era 2 series in preparation for the release of The Lost Metal on November 15th. Got quite a few notes here. So if you haven't seen my announcement video, you can check it out. The link will be in the description to this video, but I'm going to be going through. I've got a schedule broken down. I'm going to be breaking up each book into 4 sections and reading each one. And then in between each book, I'm going to do a review of that book. So obviously today we're starting out with Alloy of Law, and we will be talking about the prologue through chapter 5. And then next week we'll be doing chapter 6 through chapter 10. So if you want to follow along with me, please feel free to do so. And we're just going to talk about it real fast. So quickly before I get into discussing the chapter, spoilers ahead for not just this section of the book, but the entire book. I'm not going to, and Era 1 as well. I'm just going to talk about it. I'm not going to worry about any spoilers. No spoilers for books 2 and 3, but spoilers for this entire book and for all of Era 1. So, be forewarned. So the prologue, obviously, we have Wax going through an abandoned town in search of a man named Bloody Tan, and the results are disastrous, if you remember. He ends up accidentally killing his wife, Lessie. I want to say that there's a really good quick reintroduction to the way that steel pushing works here in this chapter. There's only one paragraph, just a quick explanation. The lines, he pushes on them, things go away, or he goes away. It's done very succinctly and a lot faster than the explanation in Mistborn Era 1. And I think that works here partially because most of the people reading this are going to have read Mistborn Era 1, obviously. But then also, even if you haven't read Mistborn Era 1, I think it works because he's only explaining steel pushing here. He's not explaining tin, he's not explaining pewter, he's not explaining iron pulling, he's just doing steel pushing, and it works a lot. It makes the whole thing go a lot faster. The new tone and the setting are established very quickly too. He gives the example of, he gives the surroundings very quickly. There's an old fence, it's a dusty area, there's a blacksmith, a water pump, and that does a lot of, I think it's a very good job that he does in just a couple sentences to set up, the Western setting in our minds and give us a very good idea of the time period and all of that. A lot of solid work done in the prologue here to set up the tone for the book and the series as it goes forward. I also really like the characterization of Wax's eye twitching when he gets upset. It continues on past the prologue, but we see the first example of it here. And then I also wanted to talk about the fact that Miles is mentioned here in the prologue on page 3 or 4. So really quickly, just blink and you miss it. It says his name one time, and so I like that foreshadowing, kind of setting up who the villain of this book is. And then also something that has bothered me as I've followed this series along is that the fact that Wax and Lessie were married is just kind of comes a little bit out of left field in the second book. And so I've been, on this reread, I'm paying really close attention to any mention or indication that they were married, and it's not mentioned here in this prologue at all. There is some indication later on in a later chapter, but nothing about wedding rings, nothing about, he doesn't think of her as his wife, he thinks of her as that woman, Lessie, so on and so forth. So I have been trying to figure out whether Brandon was trying to keep it open-ended or if it was a detail that he invented as he continued to build out the world when he did the outline for the rest of the series. So chapter 1 is a pretty simple chapter. Wax is going through a ball and he's feeling very flustered and frustrated. He's relocated to Elendel, the capital, after the unfortunate death of his wife. And then he goes out to the balcony, jumps out, and goes patrolling through the city, climbs up a skyscraper, and ends up coming across a group of thieves and freezes in combat as a result of what happened with his wife. So here again, there's a lot of characterization, a lot of character work being done. In fact, this chapter basically contributes nothing to the plot. It is only there to establish Wax as a character and who he is and how he operates. I really like a lot of the details that we start to get in this chapter about Ket Mansion, about the city being named Elendel, Harmony. This is when we start getting all those callbacks to Era 1 that really reward the fans of the series who have been following it, who waited for Alloy of Law, and who just absolutely fell in love with the characters and the location in Mistborn Era 1. Also, I really like the skyscraper subplot in this book and the way that it mimics real-world history in New York. Just kind of a random detail, but I've always been a fan of that. Also, the story goes out of its way here to show the reader that Wax right now in his patrolling of the city is escapism for him. It is not something he needs to be doing. It's not something he should be doing. It is escapism, pure and simple. And it kind of makes me wonder how much of Vin's constant patrolling of the cities in Mistborn Era 1 was the same thing. Because we do know, like, in Well of Ascension, obviously, there were a lot of times she wouldn't have ran into Zane if she hadn't been patrolling. She wouldn't have run into all the assassins in chapter 1 if she hadn't been patrolling. But there are definitely several parts. There is definitely that kind of implication here that maybe a lot of what she was doing was escapism, and considering her mental state, it's not unlikely. Also, I like that mist cloaks here turned into mist coats, and I really like the question that Brandon Sanderson answered, that the mist cloak will always be a thing in Scadrian society. I really like that. Oh, also, I really like the line that Wax thinks here about how most mistings don't use whiskey for their metal reserves and how they are missing out. And they're missing an opportunity to drink some perfectly fine whiskey. I actually really like that detail, and it gives me a chuckle every time, so I like that. Also, in this chapter where he drops down into the group of thieves and he hears a woman whimper and then it turns out to just be an injured man, I really like that as a depiction of trauma and the way that things will trigger somebody who's been through trauma, and I just really appreciate the detail there. I think that he could have, not faced it so directly, but he chose not to. He chose to actually give it the depth and the character work that it deserved. Also in this chapter, we get our introduction of Wax's butler, Tillamane. I'm not going to say his name again because I don't want to take the time to figure out how to say it. I really like, going forward, the way that Brandon Sanderson plays specifically off of the fans from Era 1, our expectation of who a terraceman is based on Sazed and Twindle, and plays against that and kind of, tricks us a little bit. As I was reading this chapter, I found myself reflecting on how there's not a substantial amount, but a surprising amount of similarities between this book and Way of Kings. It's in regards to Shallan's story in Way of Kings, It's about a noble house down on its luck, and basically the last relevant heir having to figure out a way to get the house through it. It's obviously executed very differently here, but it is the same thing. And then also, to start out this book, there's 2 time skips back to back, whereas in Way of King, in the Way of Kings, there's 3, but it's not something that I can think of Brandon Sanderson doing in any other place except for these 2 locations, starting out a book with multiple time skips. So, just an odd similarity that I noticed, and this book was written not very long after The Way of Kings came out. I can't remember exactly the publication year, but it was pretty close. It was basically his next, he did some Wheel of Time books, but it might have been his very next book, or right after, either, it would have been Towers of Midnight, right after that. So it's interesting to see that he kind of did the same thing twice. I don't know what that was. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I just found it interesting. Also, the end of this chapter is surprisingly bittersweet for something so early in the book, with Wax boxing up all of his misting stuff, all of his guns and his mist coat, and giving them to the butler to have him go pack off. And it serves in a lot of ways as a second goodbye to Era 1, where he's packing up the things that are familiar and comfortable to us as the audience, and he's putting them in a box and he's sending them away, and he's taking a break from that life. Obviously, he does end up coming back to it, but that's later in the story, and we as the audience have then accepted this new world of Mistborn, hopefully, by the time he gets all those items back. Moving into chapter 2, the conversation between Wax and the butler about cravats is very well done, little piece of character work, and it also reminds me of the Boots monologue in Towers of Midnight, for those of you who've read The Wheel of Time. It's not actually similar really in any way, but it just kind of has that Brandon Sanderson flavor to both of them, and the Boots monologue is actually something that Wheel of Time fans have pointed to as being a particularly Brandon moment in that book. And is it Towers of Midnight or is it The Gathering Storm? I don't care enough to check, so I'm just going to stick with Towers of Midnight for now. But yeah, it kind of reminded me, it does come off very Brandon Sanderson, and not in a bad way. I enjoy both, but I just like it as a piece of character work. So in chapter 2, we see Wax several months after giving up the misting life, the life of the lawman, and he's meeting Lord Harms and his daughter and his niece for the first time, in basically to meet to see if they should become engaged, him and Steris, Lord Harms' daughter. And Wayne shows up unexpectedly. Also in this chapter, we get some indications that he was married to Lessie. He has a couple thoughts that leave it open. He thinks about how nobody here knows about Lessie. Right after thinking that the maid doesn't refers to every unmarried man as young master or young, and so it's kind of there, but he still never outright says it. Also, I found myself thinking in this chapter, I don't remember the character of the maid, Miss Grimes, showing up at any other point in the book, or in any other of the books in the series. So I'm kind of wondering if this character just fell off, was forgotten about. I'm actually not sure. But I am going to try to keep an eye out for her. I might just forget about it. Also, Brandon Sanderson does a really good job in this scene of making Harms come off as kind of low nobility, as distinctly different from Wax, and distinctly different from, who is also distinctly different from the rest of the nobility. Wax comes off as exactly what he is a nobleman who spent a lot of time living at Rough, but he has that surety in himself, and Harms comes off as trashy. His daughter does not, and his nephew does not, and his niece does not, but he comes off as kind of trashy, low nobility. And I don't think it ever actually says where on the pecking the harms are, but I have always gotten the impression that he was low nobility, just very wealthy. I like the little subtle hint here when Steris brings up mistresses and their contract that she presents to Wax. Maurice looks down and avoids eye contact. And it's just one line, but if you know, then you know she is a bastard child, and it's just a really nice piece of character work there. Very subtle and very quick. So in this chapter, I really like the introduction of Wayne here. He is honestly one of my favorite characters. He's definitely a fan favorite among Brandon Sanderson fans. Everybody loves Wayne and his hats and his accents and his borrowing or trading of items. He is very Brandon Sanderson quirky character. He comes off as very similar to the Lopin and several other characters throughout the Cosmere, but I really like him, and most people do. And it's a very good introduction to him, though I feel like we get to know him a lot better in a couple chapters. But Steris and Maurice are not super well introduced here. Steris comes off as just a very cold person, very methodical, which she is, but there's a lot more to Steris than what you see at the surface. She's one of my absolute favorite characters. There's a lot below the surface. There's a lot of depth to her as a character. And then Maurice is just very silent, and obviously we know why, but it just kind of gives a false impression of her as a character. And I've actually been seeing just recently online the last couple of days on the Cosmere subreddit several people talking about how Maurice and the way that she is characterized here in this first book kind of threw them off of Era 2 for a little while because they were sick of the shy, unsure girl mentor thing in fiction, and they were very well pleased to find out that later on that dynamic goes entirely away and that there's a lot more to Maurice as a character. But it does give a false impression here in this book, and I don't hate it, but it is what it is. Oh, also, quickly in the second chapter, we have the plot set up for the first time. So we basically spent, we're going to spend 4 chapters, if you include the prologue, just establishing Wax first as a character, but then Wayne and Maurice and the setting. He really takes his time for such a fast-paced book to establish the new setting and the new characters and to really flesh them out at the beginning before he just goes through the rest of the story. So in the third chapter, I wanted to say here that I really like the tea quirk with the butler. It is another one of those things that if you're very well versed in Brandon Sanderson, it's going to misdirect you even more from the fact that the butler is a traitor, because that is the sort of thing that Brandon Sanderson gives to his heroes as like a quirk, or his passive POVs and the interludes and the Stormlight Archive is he does a lot of these weird personality quirks where they're super experts on whatever random thing. An example that springs to mind, if you've ever read the unpublished drafts of Warbreaker that Brandon Sanderson has on his website, there's a character that's a cook. I think she actually does make it into the final draft, but in a much reduced role. But she's convinced that she can tell whether or not something's done cooking by the sound that it makes when she hits it with her spoon. And it's just that sort of weird character quirk thing that Brandon does with a lot of his characters. Wayne has his hats, and the butler is obsessed with tea for no reason whatsoever. Granted, it fits very well with the setting, but I think for those who had already read all of Brandon Sanderson's books when this came out, it does a lot to assist with his misdirect here. Also, I like the whole paper on the wall thing. I like the methodical nature that Wax has, and I really like the fact that he adds the little doodle of the bandits to the top of the sheet here when because he misses Wax. Yeah, because he misses Wax and like needs that little doodle for things to feel right to him. Also, I really like the world building detail that is kind of just dropped here, where there was a person who ran for office and won in a landslide based solely on the platform that they were a copper, a smoker, a copper field. I'm forgetting. Oh, based solely on the fact that they were a copper cloud. And I think that that makes quite a bit of sense actually for the world that's established here and everything going forward. Also, I think that the Pathian religion and its introduction here in this chapter is Wax meditates towards the end of the chapter is one of my favorite details because not only does it fit Sazed's personality, it builds on his arc, Sazed's arc from book 3, and it also reflects Buddhism and Taoism and a lot of those other things, a lot of Eastern religions, and harmony itself, the concept of harmony. It really does a good job of all three of those. And I just think that it's a solid piece of world building, and I really enjoy it. So here in chapter 4, we have Wax and Steris arriving at the wedding party, the yeoman wedding, and they go through, they sit down and have a conversation with Marisi and with Lord Harm, or Ham, or whatever his name is, and Wayne comes up disguised as a butler. Also, I really like the character detail here that both Wax and Vin struggle with paranoia. He thinks to himself, I'm not paranoid, which is, as we know, something that Vin thought to herself all the time. And it honestly comes off as though in order to be the Mistborn protagonist, you have to struggle with paranoia, because it's not so much a detail in it's not a character trait for Raoden and Elantris. It's not a character trait for Kaladin or Dalinar. I mean, Kaladin does get a little bit paranoid when he is Dalinar's bodyguard, but then when he's not, it goes away. And it makes sense for him to be paranoid. That's his job as the bodyguard. But both Wax and Vin are just paranoid people. And yeah, I hope that he continues to make paranoia a character trait for all of the Mistborn protagonists, because I would find that very funny. The fact that Wax takes the time to think about the room's layout for a gunfight is some pretty heavy-handed foreshadowing for what's about to happen in just 2 chapters, but I definitely enjoy it. Also, here in chapter 4, we get Brandon Sanderson taking the time to establish the last of our 3 main protagonists, Marisi, as an actual character, where in the last chapter she wasn't so well established. And we also get a lot more time given to the relationship between Wax and Wayne, which is definitely one of the most important things that makes this book work, and also sets the tone for the series and as a whole. So chapter 5, we have the bandits bust in, and Wax keeps telling Wayne, stop, we're not going to fight them, too many people. And then right at the very end of the chapter, the bandit leader, who we know is Miles, shoots one of the bystanders, and Wax is done. Also, Marisi and Steris get taken off to be kidnapped. Wax is done. He's changes his mind, and he's going to go for it. They throw up a speed bubble, and the chapter ends with them dropping the speed bubble. Here we get Wayne, the first interaction with Wayne and Hats as the Koloss-blooded, which I love the fact that Koloss become an independent species in this book. But the Koloss-blooded bandit takes Wayne's hat, and so that's the first time that we see Wayne caring about hats. Also, this chapter is surprisingly tense. Got my heart racing just as I read it, even though I've read it like 4 or 5 times before. I think that the fact that he takes so long to kind of slow burn the build up to this fight is really what makes it so tense, but I really enjoy it. And it builds into that thriller vibe that this book has. Not that it's a straight up thriller, but it really builds on that. So yeah, that's the prologue through chapter 5 of The Alloy of Law. I hope you enjoyed this quick little read along summary, my thoughts, reread, whatever this is exactly. If you like this content, you can subscribe to my channel where I review all sorts of science fiction and fantasy books. Please do consider commenting and liking the video. It really helps a lot to get this out there to more people. You can also find me on Twitch, where I play games every Wednesday and Thursday at 4:30 p.m. and every other Sunday at noon. And you can follow me on... Twitch is The Light in My Man Cave. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at The Light in My Library, where I post my upcoming schedule and I chat with other fans about all sorts of things. And I hope you have a good one.